Hi, in this video, I'm going to talk about the need to transition from IP version 4 to IP version 6. So in previous videos, I've talked about two versions of IP, IPv4 and IPv6. So let's get into this a little bit. I'll be talking much more about both of these protocols in later videos. So beginning with IP version 4. You notice that IPv4 was actually developed a long time ago, in the early 1980s. The RFCs are their requests for comments. So those are the original documents that describe this standard. Way back, 1980, 1981. So IPv4 is a 32-bit addresses. That means addresses are represented in 32 bits. But we use a dotted decimal notation to represent these addresses. So every 8 bits is represented by a decimal number. We'll look at IPv4 and addressing in a later video in more detail. Okay. But 32 bits provides at a maximum 4.29 billion addresses. You might think, well, why didn't they have more addresses back in the 1980s? Why not provide more addresses? Because you might have heard we've run out of IPv4 addresses. Well, at the time, 4.29 billion seemed like a lot of addresses. Let's take a look at what the world was like back in 1981 when IPv4 came about. So 4.29 billion addresses was about 1-to-1 ratio with the world's population. And what was the internet like back in 1981? Well, there was no World Wide Web, no mobile devices. Most people had never even heard of the internet. Most people had no reason to network their computers or even attach to anything called the internet. So having an IP address, no one cared. All they needed was maybe their personal computer. Most of the computers prior to the 80s were mainframe and mini computers and super mini computers that were found in businesses. But it was back in starting in the 1970s, we called them microcomputers, were introduced. The first personal computers, you could actually own your own computer. That was an amazing thing back in the 1970s. But in 1981, when IPv4 came about, the IBM PC was just introduced, and it was trying to overtake the Apple II, which it did. And so still though, we didn't need IP addresses on these computers because nobody was really even thinking about, excuse me, networking them together, maybe connecting it to a printer with a parallel cable. But other than that, we weren't really looking at putting these things on large networks or even on the internet. So at the time, everybody having an IP address seemed like, we'll never get to the point where we'll need everybody to have an IP address. Well, in the 1990s, the internet began to take off with the World Wide Web. Okay, and everybody was getting on the internet. Email was one of the other big reasons to get on the internet, and of course, the World Wide Web. And we saw internet routing tables begin to grow rapidly. Matter of fact, the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, realized as early as the early 1990s that they were going to run out of IP version 4 addresses. Because it wasn't, just everybody was getting devices, and people were getting multiple devices even. Maybe a computer at home, computers at work. Then we also need addresses for all the devices that connect to the internet. They realized it was just a matter of time. Actually, they thought by 1997, 1998, that we would run out of IP version 4 addresses. So they had to come up with both short-term and long-term solutions. The short-term solution was actually two things that would, three things, but two things together I'm going to talk about: network address translation and private address space. I'll talk about these in a later video, but together, this is really what has saved IPv4 and kind of kept us from transitioning to IPv6 sooner than we probably should have. There are some problems with NAT and private address space that I won't get into here, but it actually causes problems with like peer-to-peer networking and latency and breaks a lot of applications. And it's also a management issue for service providers. But what's important here is, and let me kind of grab my pen here. Okay, is that we had private address space that anybody could use. You might even recognize some of these addresses. This is a very common address to have at home, a 192.168 address or a 1010 address to have at home. But anybody could use those addresses. And hundreds, even thousands of private addresses within your network could get translated, thousands get translated to a single public address. So this allowed us to kind of start conserving these public addresses representing thousands of internal addresses. And I'll get into NAT and that more a little later. All right. I also mentioned a third option, or a third solution, excuse me, CIDR, classless interdomain routing. We'll take a look at this also later, more in a later video. But that's when we started looking at how we're actually dividing up the IPv4 address space and making it a lot more efficient. The long-term solution, you might have guessed it, IPv6. But you might be wondering, hey, Rick, you said we have IPv4, we have IPv6, whatever happened to IPv5? Well, IPv5 was an experimental streaming protocol that was never really used and didn't really change anything as far as the IP header concerned. But there was already a standard that involved using a version number called IPv5. So we went from IPv4 to IPv6. Okay, so why the need to get to IPv6 now? Well, we are running out of IPv4 address space. Back in 2011, IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, they're the ones that actually allocate IP address space, IPv4 and IPv6, to 5 regional organizations, as you can see there. They ran out of IPv4 address space back in 2011. Since then, 4 out of the 5 regional internet registries, RIRs, have also run out of IPv4 addresses. So what this means is that we have 1 RIR left in Africa, and the only ones left with IPv4 addresses, for the most part, in these other areas are the internet service providers. And they are severely limited, and some of them have run out. So we really have no choice but to transition to IPv6. And that is happening. You may not even realize that you're running IPv6 on your mobile devices and even at home. And the move is transparent to most of the consumers, the end users, and that's the way it should be. We'll talk more about this later. But here's another look at why we need to transition to IPv6. So if you look at the world's population and the number of internet users, so look at North America, we're about 360 million people, okay? And by the way, we only make up 4.8% of the world's population. If you look at Africa and Asia, they're over 5 billion people, and they make up 70% of the world's population together. Well, you look at the United States, for just under 5% of the world's population, we're fine. We're 95% internet penetration rate, meaning we're fine with how many of our devices kind of currently that we need to have IP addresses, although this is changing. with the Internet of Things and many other things, but we're pretty well off as far as IPv4. But you look at other parts of the world, they're just getting on to the internet. Okay, look at that 5 billion people. That's about only 40% of them have internet connectivity. And even in North America, we're going to need, we have more devices, we have Internet of Things. We're going to really need to start to transition to IPv6. Okay, so introducing IPv6. First of all, it's not a new protocol. It was developed initially in the mid to late 1990s, but there's been a lot of changes to it since then. A lot was learned from IPv4, not just larger address space, 128-bit addresses instead of 32 bits, but they modified the protocol. They also modified the rest of a lot of the other protocol to make it a lot more efficient protocol. So I mentioned it's 128-bit addresses that we write in hexadecimal. 128 bits gives us 340 undecillion addresses. That's a lot of addresses. Okay. Instead of the 4.29 billion that IPv4 gives us. So you may say, well, aren't we wasting a lot of bits? No, we're not cutting down binary trees to do this or anything like this, but it makes the management of our IP address space for subnetting and other things that we'll talk more about later a whole lot easier. Okay, give you another look at what this looks like. So there's a billion. We have 4.29 billion IPv4 addresses. And if we keep on going down this list, let's get to undecillion. There we go, 340 undecillion IPv6 addresses. A whole lot of addresses. Okay, so the move from IPv4 to IPv6, many of the benefits include obviously larger address space, but also some other things you'll learn about more later, including something called stateless auto configuration. Don't worry about these things now. We'll talk about them later. End-to-end reachability without private addresses and NAT, network address translation. We get rid of all the problems NAT creates. Better mobility support. Peer-to-peer networking is easier, also easier VoIP and voice over IP, that is, and quality of service. And really, what is the killer application for the internet? It's the internet itself. To continue moving forward with using the internet, we're going to have to move to IPv6.